The main components of the autonomic nervous system are dendrites and the cell body. The dendrites and the cell bodies travel through axons and then to an axon terminal. The axon terminal is what releases neurotransmitters. There are two families of neurotransmitter receptors. The first is ionotropic. They have a site where a neurotransmitter can bind called a binding site. When a neurotransmitter binds here, it causes a channel to open in the receptor and ions can flow into the neuron. This sends a signal in the action potential. The other type is called a metabotropic receptor. Neurotransmitters also bind to these receptors, but instead of immediately opening an ion channel, the next step after binding is the activation of an intermediate protein called a G protein. G protein can then influence the opening of ion channels. It can also affect enzymes and activate second messengers. They tend to have a slower action but a more widespread effect. One of the biggest neurotransmitters involved in the autonomic nervous system is acetylcholine. So what acetylcholine does is it binds to a receptor, and there are a few different receptors that it's able to bind to. So the first receptor is a nicotinic receptor, and a nicotinic receptor is a protein that signals for muscular contraction upon a chemical stimulus, which is transported by the ACH. When ACH binds to a nicotinic receptor, the response is always excitatory. So what exactly does that mean? This nicotinic receptor is an ion channel. An ion channel allows sodium and potassium to move in the directions that they need to go. Sodium floods in, and potassium slowly leaks out. This is excitation in an action potential. Now, the acetylcholine can bind to another group of receptors called the muscarinic receptor. Some of these muscarinic receptors are excitatory and some are inhibitory, depending on where it is happening in the body. These receptors are a G protein covered receptor. This opens potassium channels, causing hyperpolarization or inhibition. This causes a reduction of heart rate. So on the other hand, another function of the muscarinic receptor is that it can bind to smooth muscle in the GI tract. So that's now a depolarization. It's still a G protein coupled receptor, but the potassium channels are closing. So now we're going to look at epinephrine and norepinephrine. There are 5 receptors that they can bind to. They vary depending on where they are in the body and also in sensitivity, but those 5 are shown right here. So here are all the receptors, alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1 through beta 3, and I've listed where they are found in. And also right here, it states what receptor they're more sensitive to. So alpha 1 is more receptive to norepinephrine than epinephrine, whereas beta 1, they're about the same, and then beta 2 is more sensitive to epinephrine than norepinephrine. So when epinephrine or norepinephrine binds to these receptors, they have different effects. So right here you can see that when it binds to alpha 1, it activates a phospholipase C, leading to IP3. So this is crucial for signaling in the body, and it also activates calcium levels that cause muscle contraction. And last, when it binds to any of the beta receptors, there is an increase in the cyclic AMP. So the thing that's unique about the autonomic nervous system is that it takes 2 neurons to do what a lot of the other systems only use 1 for. What happens is neuron number 1 releases a neurotransmitter onto a receptor that's far away from the target, called a ganglia. And a ganglia is a collection of nerve cells that are outside of the CNS. In the ganglia, there's a neuron number 2, right here, which then releases a neuron transmitter onto the final target. These 2 neurons are called the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. Okay, now we're going to look at the parasympathetic division. So in the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neuron is always cholinergic, meaning that it releases acetylcholine. The receptors on the ganglion are always nicotinic, so the signal is always excitatory. The postganglionic neuron is also cholinergic. The receptor type on the target cells are different. They are muscarinic. Depending on which type, remember the 5 subtypes that we talked about, it will either be excitatory or inhibitory. In the heart, it would be inhibitory, whereas in the smooth muscle of the GI tract, it would be excitatory. Alright, in the sympathetic pathway, the preganglionic neuron is also cholinergic. The receptors are also nicotinic. The difference is in the postganglionic neuron. In the sympathetic division, it is adrenergic. It releases the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. The targets are the adrenergic receptors, either alpha or beta. The effect depends on which one. We also have the adrenal sympathetic pathway. It is still a cholinergic preganglionic neuron released onto a nicotinic receptor. The only difference is that it's not a ganglion, it's a medulla. It is released onto an adrenal gland. This is different because the cortex is actually a gland, and the medulla is modified nervous tissue, so it acts like a postganglionic neuron, but it's not an actual neuron. It releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, and they're released like hormones into the bloodstream. They bind to adrenergic receptors found all over the body. The strange thing is that there's no postganglionic neuron in the adrenal sympathetic pathway. The vagus nerve is one of 12 paired cranial nerves. Besides output to the various organs in the body, the vagus nerve conveys a sensory information about the state of the body's organs to the central nervous system. The vagus nerve is extremely long, extending from the brainstem all the way to the viscera, all internal organs in the chest, abdomen, and pelvis. The vagus nerve is crucial in regulating heartbeat, controlling muscle movement, keeping you breathing, chemical sending, and upkeep of the GI functioning. The vagus nerve is important in bronchodilation. Bronchodilation is the widening of the bronchial tubes, allowing increased airflow to and from the lungs.